It's our second snippet for the first part of this week is going to look at imperialism in 19th century U.S. foreign policy, which is it's a good example of one of the patterns that I was talking about in the first snippet of the intersection between domestic politics and foreign affairs, and very, very broadly, again, we're kind of accelerating through this 19th century stuff. 19th century imperialism divides into two segments: pre and post Civil War. Pre-Civil War, there is an intersection between imperialism and slavery in a couple of ways. That anti-slavery advocates tend to be anti-imperialist, in part because they are, at least some of them, are arguing for the equality of the races, and they argue that imperialism presumes a kind of white supremacy. And a great example of this is this very important incident in congressional history, the gag rule. One of the things that there was a custom in Congress where if you sent a petition to Congress in the 19th century, that petition would be the clerk would come and they would read it on the floor of the House of Representatives. It would then be printed and they could be disseminated around the country. So abolitionist activists present these petitions to Congress calling for the abolition of slavery, but sometimes also calling for the U.S. recognition of Haiti, the second independent country in the Western Hemisphere after the U.S., but a country that isn't recognized by the U.S. until the Civil War because Southerners do not want. Haiti is a almost exclusively Black country. The Southerners do not want a Black ambassador in Washington, D.C., because that would seem to undermine the idea of Black inferiority that is a core element of Southern political thought in the pre-Civil War period. And so the House, to get around the idea that these petitions could be printed and then disseminated, imposes what's called the gag rule, which allows a majority of the House to simply refuse to basically receive the petitions. They table it. It's never read. So anti-slavery advocates tend to be anti-imperialist because they want to see the United States embrace independence and equality in the surrounding areas. Pro-slavery advocates tend to be imperialists because there's a theory that emerges in the 1830s and 1840s that slavery must expand or it will die. And so Southerners push the idea of expansion into the Caribbean basin, the Caribbean countries themselves, Central America and Mexico, as a way of creating more slave states, more opportunities for plantations, and ensuring slave power in the country. And this really tips off in the election of 1844, one of the, I think one of the 4 or 5 most important presidential elections in American history, between James Polk, who was the Democratic nominee, and Henry Clay, who was the nominee of the Whig Party. Polk is an advocate for U.S. Expansion to the south and also to the north. He wants to annex Texas, which had declared itself independent from Mexico 8 years before in 1836 and had waged a brief war of independence. Clay does not want annexation because he's worried about the precedent that it will set, and he's fearful that the admission of Texas as a slave state will disrupt U.S. Political unity. He's absolutely correct in this respect. This is an incredibly close election. Polk very narrowly wins the popular vote. It looks on this chart as if he wins the electoral vote by a more convincing margin, but this is very deceptive. Polk wins New York with 36 electoral votes, thanks to the vote of a third-party candidate, the Liberty Party, which argued that Clay was insufficiently supportive of abolitionism. And if New York's 36 electoral votes had gone to Clay would have wound up with 141 electoral votes, and Clay would have been president. But that doesn't happen. Polk is president. Texas is quickly admitted to the Union. There is a disputed area that both the Texans and then eventually the U.S. claim and Mexico claims. The result is a war which is basically initiated by Polk. Congress does declare war, but Polk orders American forces into this disputed area. The Mexicans fire back because they claim that it's Mexican territory, and Polk argues that, look, we need to declare war. This is a 2-year conflict. It is a bitter conflict in which the U.S. is militarily superior, conquers not merely the disputed area in Texas, but all of the blue area here out to California. There are some calls for the U.S. to annex all of Mexico as a result of this, but support for Polk is undermined in this effort. Some Southern slavery advocates, most importantly, a California senator, a South Carolina senator named John C. Calhoun, oppose the annexation of Mexico because they don't like the idea of admitting non-white peoples to the Union. And it's this odd anti-imperialist alliance of Northern abolitionists and Southern racists that basically circumscribe what Polk wants to do. But nonetheless, the U.S. acquires all of this territory from Mexico. And this is also a period which is sometimes known as the filibustering period. That is, private U.S. interests launch attacks from the South, mostly, on Mexico, Central America, and Cuba. To conquer these territories in the name of slavery and then to admit them to the United States. The only one of these which sort of succeeds is Nicaragua, where an American named William Walker manages to get himself appointed president for a couple of years in the 1850s and petitions the United States for annexation of Nicaragua to the U.S. as a slave state. President Pierce can't get it through Congress. The big move, though, of the filibusters is Cuba. Cuba is a slave society. It's a Spanish colony in the 1840s and 1850s. And so Southerners see in annexation of Cuba a way to expand the empire of slavery, to reframe Jefferson's language. And in 1854, the 3 major U.S. ambassadors to Europe, headed by James Buchanan, future president, issue what's called the Ostend Manifesto, in which they present a document to the government of Spain demanding that Spain turn Cuba over to the United States. Spain refuses to do so. Efforts to annex Cuba, there are many of them throughout the 1850s, ultimately fail. And with the Civil War, the idea of expansion to the South to acquire pro-slavery territory largely goes away. So that's the first imperialist surge, expansion to the Caribbean basin, with the goal, or primarily with the goal, of expanding access to slavery. There is, however, a second surge of imperialism from the United States, focused more in the latter half of the 19th century and focused in part in South America, but mostly on East Asia. This is a map of China in the 19th century. China remains nominally an independent country in the 19th century, but you see all of these striped areas here. China is effectively carved up by the European powers, the British, the French, the German, and the Russians, and then later in the game by the Japanese, who emerge as a major power in East Asia by the latter part of the 19th century. You will see here that the U.S. does not assume any territory in China, but the U.S. is active in a kind of cultural imperialism. American missionaries promoting a kind of American Protestant worldview focus on China throughout the 19th century. And these missionaries are on the ground in China. They demand protection from the U.S. military. There's an active U.S. trade with China. So there's this sense that even though the U.S. is not a nominal player in imperialism in China, the U.S. does need to play an important role. And that begins the process of American imperialism in the Pacific, which begins in 1867 with the acquisition of Alaska, which Secretary of State William Seward wants, not because Alaska, is important in and of itself, although it turns out it is, with gold and then later with oil, but because it's strategically vital in providing a degree of access to the North Pacific, and then continues with the acquisition of the Midway Islands, the acquisition of Samoa in the South Pacific, and finally with the acquisition of Hawaii. And this emphasis on imperialism, there are multiple thrusts. So part of it is simply a kind of racist imperialism of the United States has an obligation to expand Christian values. This missionary named Josiah Strong publishes this book called Our Country in 1888. This is basically Strong's argument. But there are two other important arguments for imperialism. The first is economic. There's a fear in the late 19th century that the United States is falling behind in international trade. You see, it runs a trade deficit basically every year after 1881. And that the way to get around this would be perhaps to acquire colonies, and that would ensure easy access to raw materials. And then the second is this fear that the U.S., if it doesn't acquire colonies, is falling behind. This is a map of the colonization of Africa, almost all of which, at least in the sub-Saharan part of the country, occurs in the last couple of decades of the 19th century. So there's this great imperial scramble in the late 19th century, and there's this sense that, well, all of the other major powers are trying to acquire colonies. If the United States doesn't do so, that could be problematic for the U.S. And that's going to set the stage for the third snippet that we'll look at for today, which will be the Spanish-American War.